Good afternoon, everyone. It looks like people are still joining us, so we'll start in a few moments. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Delisa Swagger-Wamsley. I'm the Donor Relations Coordinator at the Walters Art Museum. I would like to thank you today, our members, for your support of the Walters Art Museum, especially during this time. You're supporting the virtual museum for the Baltimore community and beyond. And while we're unable to open our doors because of the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm so happy that you can join us today for our second virtual member talk. Before we start, I'd like to ask you to please mark your calendars for the next virtual member talk on September 16th at 12:30 p.m. with Lisa Anderson-Zhu, the Associate Curator of Ancient Mediterranean Art. An invitation for registration will come to your inbox soon. Today we are joined by the Manager of Individual Giving, Erin Malott, and Ellen Hoobler, the William B. Ziff Jr. Associate Curator, Art of the Americas, 1200 BCE to 1500 CE. Ellen has been with the Walters since February 2017, and she's a specialist in the art of ancient Latin America. Today, Ellen will share a vessel with us from the Sican culture of Peru. It's made to function, but not only as a vessel or a figurine, but also as a musical instrument. And since today we're joined by about 30 of our members, your audio will be muted, but there will be an opportunity for you to ask any questions and for us to answer those questions. We ask that you use the chat or the Q&A features of Zoom to ask your question. And Erin and I will be moderating your questions and present them to Ellen at the end of the presentation. So now I present to you Ellen with today's talk.
Hi everyone, I'm so glad to have all of you here on my virtual tour. Since if we were at the museum, I would be able to just stand with you in the gallery in front of our object. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started with the presentation. Today, I'm going to discuss some recent research that the Walters has been conducting into some of the works in the Ancient Americas collection. I should emphasize that this is not fully finished research, so we're kind of giving you a sneak peek into a still in process research that we're working on. As Delisa mentioned, this is a vessel that has multiple purposes, and curators are often trained as art historians, and so we might put most of our focus into the visual aspects of the works in our care. In some cases, that might mean that we've been paying too little heed to the other uses of objects or the other senses that they could activate. So today I'm going to talk a bit about some of the musical instruments and noise-making objects in the Art of the Americas collection, and particularly a specific Peruvian work which I was able to investigate more fully with an undergraduate intern last year, and which, as I will discuss, we plan to continue to work on in the future. As a side note, this research forms the basis for an article in the Walters Art Museum Journal that has, since the last issue, gone completely online and is available to be read by anyone. The online format has allowed for it to have multimedia aspects to it that are really engaging and exciting. So I've got here the link to the journal, which Delisa will also be putting into the chat and I believe sending out to people after this presentation. At a time when so many of us are at home, and I know many people have been missing that opportunity to come and interact physically with the objects in the museum, but the journal would provide you with a way to connect in a new, in-depth way with some of the objects in the collection. Now, it might not be that every article speaks to you. I have to admit, some of those articles from conservation, they are geniuses when it comes to chemistry and understanding alloys and materials, but sometimes the more technical language goes completely over my head. But I promise you that if you find an article that really piques your interest and you do go deep into some of these objects that people have written about so brilliantly recently, when we all do get back into the museum and are able to look at works in person again, you will see it in a completely new light. So just wanted to give that a bit of a plug. And really that in-depth examination and how deep looking, deep consideration causes you to look at things differently is at the heart of the scholarship that we are able to undertake as curators here at the Walters. It's not just evident in the articles that we write, but also how those ideas come out in the exhibitions we curate as well. This project really came out of some experiments that I was undertaking in the exhibitions I put up in the third floor manuscripts gallery in 2018 and 2019. Those themselves were a run up to a larger installation of the collection that I'm working on for a few years down the road. But as I show you this picture of the sound station that was part of the transformation exhibit between October 2018 and October 2019, it shows that I was doing some experiments to find out how I could convey the other senses that some of these works invoked when they were used in the pre-modern past. As I wrestled with the theme of transformation, I thought about music and dance, how those things can help people create rituals of transformation. And I realized that there were a surprising number of works in the Art of the Americas collection that did double duty. They weren't just ceramic figurines, but they were also whistles. So they weren't just gold jewelry, they were also tiny bells, or had many tinkling parts, which would have added an auditory dimension to the finery of ancient Panamanian rulers, for example. I incorporated that into the transformation exhibit and plan to continue to integrate the musical aspects of these objects into exhibitions in the future, because a brief census of our Art of the Americas collection revealed just how many of the ceramics especially were not just attractive figures, some beautifully detailed, but also had an auditory function. Here are some from areas other than Peru to give you a sense of how many we have. My intern, Sonia Mateus, who you'll hear more about in a bit, did a non-exhaustive census and found about 40 works among about 700 works in the collection that had a musical or noise-making function. And one of the vessels that I was looking at, in a sense, revolutionized how I was thinking about many Peruvian ceramics. So here we see it's pretty small. It's 6 3/16 inches tall by just a little over 7 inches wide. So at first glance, it could just be a small container, like an ancient canteen. Indeed, it has a narrow spout that would help to prevent the evaporation of water or whatever liquids were held inside of it. But was that what it was really used for? The head of Objects Conservation, Angie Elliott, and I started to research these spouted vessels of ancient Peru and found that they were also said to have auditory qualities, but there weren't many museums promoting this use, as everyone was pretty focused on their visual qualities. What was the symbolism painted on their, shown on their painted surfaces, or the sculpted figures on them, for example. But Angie, just in a very low-tech and easy way, was able to test the vessel out just by blowing directly into it with a pipette, which produced a high-pitched sound. I'm gonna go ahead and play you that sound right now. Admittedly, that's pretty basic. Neither Angie nor I has extensive musical experience, but as you will see, we did some outsourcing of more musical talent. But even just finding out that something that I'd considered really just from a visual standpoint had auditory qualities as well, sent me back to doing some more basic research on the vessel. It's from the Sican or Lambayeque culture, which was centered on the north coast of what is today Peru in South America. Here you get a sense of the approximate range of this Lambayeque or Sican culture. And they dominated this region between about 900 and 1100 of the current era. It just made me, but working with this object just made me wonder about whether we knew what it meant at all. The Sican people are known mostly for their metallurgy, their working of and use of prodigious amounts of gold and silver. We actually have a ceremonial cup, or akia as it was known, of the Sican people that was acquired by Henry Walters in 1911 from Tiffany Jewelers in New York. And we wish that he might have bought some of the huge gold masks that are stars of the collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for any of you who've been in their ancient treasury there. However, in pottery, the Sican are known for the black ceramics and also these tricolor ceramics painted in red and black slips. So slip being a paint made out of thinned out clay, and there were red and black slips painted onto a white ceramic background. As you can see, the ceramic painter was creating an exuberance of form, filling every surface of this vessel with the thicker red lines, acting as separators and frames, and then thinner and admittedly somewhat faded black lines horizontally winding around the spout and executed in lines and spirals around the base. The decoration with those spirals and lines makes complex what is actually a pretty simple form. There's a rounded rectangular base with a tall thin cone for the spout and a gracefully arching handle, which ends in two molded figures of birds. The birds both have elongated red beaks, the form of which helps us to identify them as being members of the Peruvian pelican species. And as you can see, one bird has been painted white and the other black. This is particularly interesting as there's a long history in the Andes of paired complementary dualities that are in opposition. We can think automatically of many such dualities, such as female and male, night and day, left and right, dry season and rainy season, or of course, black and white, all dualities which exist in nature and are readily observable. Andean cosmology and belief systems are very concerned with these kinds of dualities, and animals, plants, and deities in their representations on portable objects and in architecture often come in pairs, where one is somehow in opposition to the other. This is true not only in ceramics, nor only in the Sican Lambayeque culture, but it speaks to a broader and a long-standing interest in dualities. Our little lone akia that we looked at, that silver cup, the Walters only owns the one, but these were known to always be made in pairs, where one was a little smaller than the other or had slightly different imagery. When they were made of wood, though, we know that they were said that they had to be made from the same trunk of wood, even though one was going to be slightly smaller and slightly different. And as we see in this textile from another Andean culture, the Wari culture, in this Wari tunic or panel fragment, we see the image of a human or monkey that's transposed several different ways. So it's not just black and white, but this image is flipped across or horizontal and vertical axes, as you see here, from side to side and up to down, and then again below. And as well, the colors are transposed, giving a checkerboard effect to the whole textile. This consistent pairing and switching, whether of colors, materials, or in the case of our ceramic, black and white, is then not just an artistic choice at random, but reflects a much deeper belief system that is evident in ritual performances, in works of art and architecture, even in social order. We find that neighborhoods or quarters within towns and cities in ancient and colonial times were usually organized as paired or complementary parts. So our little whistle starts to look less like a cute little noisemaker then, and more a statement of beliefs made concrete in ceramic. This is reinforced by the iconography or imagery in the vessel. Apart from the pelicans, we have those swirling spirals on the base, often thought to represent the sea. And seabirds or pelicans are of course animals that can cross different realms, dive very deep into the water in search of their prey, and soar extremely high into the air. In fact, the writer and chronicler Inca Garcilaso de la Vega noted in the beginning of the 1600s that pelicans had a particular form of hunting. He said, "It is a thing of much pleasure to see how they fish. Many of them, the pelicans, come together like two tall towers, and from there, like trained falcons with their wings closed, they let themselves fall to hunt the fish, and they dive, entering under the water such that they seem to have drowned. And then they can be seen with the fish caught in their mouth, and flying in the air, they wolf it down." So I went into this research with the idea that it was obvious that this vessel's high-pitched sound was meant to imitate that of a Peruvian pelican, an important predator on the Pacific coast. However, interestingly, it turns out that adult Peruvian pelicans cannot make high-pitched calls like these, or any calls at all. For this species, only baby pelicans can vocalize, making a sound described as a shrill, rasping squawk to beg for food. This is not to say that adult pelicans make no noises. They make hoarse grunting sounds through moving their wings in such a way as to force air from their lungs and snap their bill together with a loud popping sound. But that's clearly not the sound the vessel is emulating. As I looked at the research that had already been undertaken into these whistling vessels, I found that art historian Juliet Wiersema has argued that North Coast cultures, about North Coast of Peru cultures that, quote, "While it is difficult to find commonalities that unite these disparate sculpted forms, one possible explanation is that all vessels with whistling mechanisms depict creatures with the ability to enter realms inaccessible to most humans." And as much as we wish we could fly, and doubly in 2020, as much as we wish we could fly, obviously birds are creatures that can in fact enter those realms inaccessible to most humans. Another scholar, Colin McEwen, also argues in effect that these vessels were important ritual paraphernalia, probably used in ceremonies. He says, quote, "The purpose of successfully fabricating the hidden whistle seems to have been to create a particular effect, to mysteriously animate the figures which conceal it." McEwen also points to ethnographic examples to bolster his argument that these types of vessels were used for rituals rather than to create music that was primarily for enjoyment or for soothing. He notes that in modern day Bolivia, specific flutes are played at different agriculturally important times of year to encourage rain to fall and plants to grow. In particular, according to McEwen, quote, "High-pitched wailing sounds are particularly associated with critical moments that mark the transition between the dry and rainy seasons in the Andes, and they are especially associated with the dead, who as a collective presence are said to help the crops grow through the rainy season." So that connection with the high-pitched sounds, the connection between high-pitched sounds, perhaps to attract the attention of supernatural beings and powers to bring rains and end the dry season, might show some connection with the iconography of this very vessel and its use of that black and white palette, suggesting a powerful dualism. Next, I turned to the mechanism of the sound to better understand the vessel. There are diagrams that show how air can enter the chamber of a vessel, although this diagram, I admit, is imprecise. In our vessel, the very narrow strap that you see here has a thin chamber through it so that air emerges from very small holes behind the necks of the pelicans. The backs of their heads protrude in such a way that those holes are perpendicular to two other small holes in the flat strap handle of the vessel. And here, fate intervened. Earlier in the year of 2018, I had taken on an intern, Sonia Mateus, an oboe student from the prestigious Peabody Conservatory. I had asked her to become an intern because she was fluent in Spanish, able to consult sources in that language, and the head of the Latinx student group at the Peabody. But she proved to have musical and acoustical knowledge far exceeding mine. That's not difficult, but she was really incredible, and it ended up being extremely useful. So simply by looking at the vessel, prior to even hearing this recording of it, and I believe Angie also played it for her, Mateus was certain that the sound produced by the vessel would be high-pitched because that very narrow airway produces greater air pressure and therefore a higher pitched sound. While some other known whistling vessels have multiple holes in the body of the vessel, potentially allowing for the creation of different tones, our vessel could only produce a single tone that was high-pitched, although Mateus noted that some differences in tone could potentially be achieved by partially filling the vessel with water and moving those liquids around as the user blew into the vessel, which is something that we know was happening with these kinds of containers. However, filling a ceramic container roughly 1,000 years old with water posed too great a challenge to its conservation, and we opted not to do that. But for anybody at home, there are amazing videos of native artists in Peru making replicas and making sounds just by moving the water around in the vessels or adding their own breath to it. And if you Google Peruvian whistling vessels, you can see those, but many of them are people who also are selling those vessels, so we didn't get permission to use that today. Mateus was also incredibly helpful because without knowing of other scholars' research into these vessels, or as she got up to speed with their research, those investigations posit a broad range of these kinds of whistles played together in conjunction to create a sound potentially more pleasing to human ears. But Mateus had already also hypothesized that since this particular instrument can only produce one extremely high pitch, as we heard, based on its dimensions, that it probably would have been played with other vessels of different shapes and sizes that were meant to be played in unison with it to create a kind of choir of different pitches. She hypothesized that the vessel might have been used in a participative ceremony in which multiple vessels whistled together to create a harmonious melody or song. As part of some of our many conversations on this, Mateus also brought up some very interesting and as yet unanswered questions regarding the context in which this vessel was used. The sound it produces is piercing, yet not overwhelmingly loud, leading her to open up some really interesting questions about what kinds of acoustic environments would have best highlighted the vessel's strengths. Were they small enclosed spaces such as tombs? Could it have even been heard in a larger plaza? Are they being used on the coastline to actually just call to the pelicans in some kind of ceremony that has to do with fishing and agriculture? Broad open spaces would seem to overwhelm the capacity of this vessel, but this one example shows how the kinds of questions that somebody who is steeped in auditory performance asks of objects like this, and how those questions might be immensely productive and quite different from the inquiries that mostly visually oriented curators may ask. So the Walters, understandably, does not allow our interns to play their ancient noisemakers, and no museum is really going to allow for partially filling a 1,000-year-old ceramic with water and sloshing it around. So what to do? As it turns out, South America, and particularly Argentina, have been becoming increasingly interested in many aspects of its pre-Columbian past, including ancient dance, ancient performance, and music. We have been contacted by several ceramics enthusiasts eager to recreate or understand better some of the works in our collection. And in 2018, I got an email from Melissa Foss, an American resident in Argentina, who was teaching in the music master's program at the Universidad 3 de Febrero there, and was helping to direct the Orchestra of Indigenous Instruments and New Technologies there as well. She had become fascinated and excited by the Walters collection since, unlike some of the other museums, we had so much that was available online. So Melissa was already basing some of her replica instruments directly on works in our collection. She was returning to the US for a visit and wanted to see in person some of the works that she'd recreated or hoped to make. We had some fascinating conversations. You can see here that she's come back to visit in the past. You see here, she'd gotten very excited about this Jalisco style flute, a flute based on a Mexican example we see on the left. This may not actually be authentic, but she'd gotten very excited and had made a replica. So you see her there in the cupola holding her replica. Don't be alarmed. We don't just allow outside researchers to take actual objects out, although I do have to say this was a whole interesting process to get a property pass, get permission to have somebody bring a replica of one of the museum's objects into the museum. Anyway, a story for another time. And this year, 2020, I was able to commission 3 replicas or reimaginings of ancient works from our Americas collection. And hopefully, as we start to be able to travel again, Melissa will first come to the museum to see the works that she'll be replicating, and we will be x-raying the vessels as well to give her more specifics on the thickness of the walls of each. So here's her prior reimagining of what our vessel could look like if it had 2 chambers, all the better for moving water around in. So we will finally be able to solve the mystery of whether water in the vessel might sweeten the sound of this whistle a little bit or change its tone significantly. But to sum up, this collaborative research has highlighted a number of different themes, even if we're not yet finished with our investigations. On the most basic and practical level, it shows how even as curators today work to understand the objects in their care in the multi-sensory ways that they originally functioned, and curators can then therefore create richer, multi-layered experiences with them, we're still very much in a default environment in which the hierarchy of senses elevates and privileges sight above other senses. As Jared Katz and other scholars have called for, curators who work with ancient objects should first simply identify the works in their collection that originally had a noise-making component to their use. Second, curators should continue to experiment with recording sounds from original vessels as long as that does not compromise the work's safety. This would permit the creation of a broad database of such sounds, potentially even across museum collections, and ultimately increase understanding of what multiple instruments played together would sound like. So I love this idea that we get some of the Walter's Sican instruments and other museums' instruments, and maybe we can create our own little orchestra to kind of understand how loud or how multiples of these could sound. Third, we should encourage the creation of replicas to further explore the sound qualities of these vessels without concern for the safety of originals. Documentation of such experimentation would allow visitors a different experience of the museum space, something the Walters has already experimented with in promoting its popular Art Sound Now programs, where live musicians perform whose melodies are related to the art on view. However, at the broadest level, and given the proximity of the Peabody Conservatory and the frequent dearth of musical experience and knowledge on the part of curators, involving musical specialists in the research would also be essential to finding plausible ways of playing these replicas. My experience with Sonia Mateus illustrates how specialists will not need extensive background in the ancient Americas specifically to be able to come to alternate understandings of such objects. We can trust their existing knowledge, knowing that it can contribute to our own understandings of the ancient Americas and its material culture in an invaluable way. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing of my screen and we'll open things up for questions now. Let me go ahead and do that.
Hello.
Hi.
So thank you, Ellen, for sharing the perspective of this wonderful piece. We will start with a question in the Q&A. I suspect blowing across the spout when there is water inside the vessel will produce different sounds.
Yeah, that's exactly, Sonia said that in some ways that this, she, really brought it down to layman's terms for me. Curators were used to trying to be the experts and explain things to other people, but it was great. Sonia was able to bring it down to layman's terms for me and say, you know, when you blow across the lip of a bottle and you can produce a sound, that's essentially what's happening here, because you've got holes in that arching strap, and that air is coming out and blowing perpendicular to other holes that are in the heads of the pelicans. That's where the whistle mechanism really is, and so that's how you're getting the sound. But definitely, you know, when you add water to this, you're changing the volume and inner geometry of this, and so you are creating a different sound to it. It should definitely create a different sound. So, and then also just moving it around, I really do urge everybody to Google Peruvian whistling vessels and look at some of the videos. Some people are just putting water in, and especially in the case of two-chambered vessels, ours is a single chamber, so it's not quite as successful, but sometimes these two-chambered vessels, as you move it back and forth, it's creating amazing sounds.
We have a couple of questions about, has the vessel been x-rayed?
Sure. I believe, so there is this question because once you x-ray a vessel that is made out of ceramics, you will have some difficulty with other types of research methods that you might want to use. So I think this vessel has not yet been x-rayed, but it's something that we might want to look at. We will want to look at for a replica of it, absolutely.
And then about a replica, have you thought about making an exact replica with 3D printing?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I know everybody's very excited about 3D printing. I myself am excited about 3D printing and have printed some things. I do wonder about 3D printing. The most common 3D printing is printing with plastic filaments, so you end up with a plastic replica. The scholar Jared Katz that I referred to, he has done 3D printed replicas in this plastic for a lot of Mayan whistles, but I really question whether the acoustics would be the same from something that's originally in ceramic. There are very, very expensive 3D printed replicas that can be printed in like a kind of a plaster or ceramic slurry, but it's extremely expensive. It just seemed like it would be better to have somebody who was already a musician do a replica. But I agree that originally I thought that could be a great solution.
Okay, we do have a question in regards to the interns.
Oh, sure.
About the different instruments. Are there larger whistling vessels in collections?
Yes, so there are many that are two-chambered. We don't have any that are two-chambered. We have, I'm trying to think, we do not have any whistling vessels that we could that Sonia and I could identify just through a visual examination that are two-chambered. But when you look, hope my article illustrates some which will come out at some point, I think later in the fall or next year, illustrates some that are in other collections that are two-chambered, and even in some cases I believe there are 3- and 4-chambered ones. I've seen certainly 3-chambered, and I think I read about one 4-chambered one. So there are larger ones, and larger vessels do tend to make louder sounds, yes.
And how many sound-making vessels does the Walters actually have?
Right, we identified, I think, 40 different noise-making objects among the Art of the Americas collection, but probably, 7 or 8 are bells. So I'd say in terms of actual whistling vessels, we're just looking at, I think, maybe 6 or 7, something like that.
Is there any evidence that these vessels may have been heated?
Wow, that's a fascinating question. I actually want to ask a question to the person who asked that question. I mean, I'm assuming you're saying that there could be a difference in the tone if it's warm water versus cold water. That's something we should definitely experiment with when we have these replicas in hand. I also have wondered about the thickness and viscosity of what is inside these vessels. So there's obviously water, and Peru, the Andes, is an incredibly dry and arid environment. So water, all liquids are really sacred. But you also have a lot of this brewing of a corn beer known as chicho. Sometimes it's corn, sometimes it's local berries. I just wonder, does chicha have some different viscosity that maybe even affects this? I don't know to what degree we're gonna be, you can find chicha in Baltimore, no doubt, but I don't know to what degree we're gonna be seeking out different liquids to try out, but that's something I should discuss with Angie Elliott, our objects conservator. I would love to know more about this idea of heating the clay. Please feel free to be in touch. I'll ask Delisa to send out my email if anybody has further questions after this, although I see we still have several.
Oh, there's a follow-up, I think, to this comment about heating, thinking about a steam kettle, which can whistle depending on the spout shape.
That's a great question. That's a great question. So you're saying it could just be, if it was just boiling and you poured it in there. I mean, very possible. I think that would not work for too many uses, that you couldn't continually be putting boiling water in there. These things are fired, but they're not fired at an incredibly high temperature. But that's a great question. And I think it's something where we want to be looking at the spout shape as well. That's a great question, Dorothy. Thank you.
Can you talk more about the replicas that were created and what they'll be used for moving forward?
Sure, yeah. So they have not been created just yet. We just commissioned Melissa to do this, and she's probably going to be making them this fall. We discussed the hope that she could come and see the works in person. We'll see how that works out, or we haven't been able to even be in the office or conservation to do any kind of x-raying. The timeline is a little bit fluid. I'm hoping that she would make them maybe early in 2021. What would we be using them for? I think really we do want to use them to replicate these sounds, record that, maybe have multiple ones of these being played at the same time. And as we move towards an installation of the Americas galleries, maybe this is something that could even be displayed in that gallery as a replica or used for groups. I think with COVID now we're much more concerned about multiple people touching objects, but potentially, it could be something where we might have a very small group from Peabody at some point in the future coming in to experiment with this, or we would even be able to bring it over to the Peabody since it's just across the street and it's a replica. Both for performance, recording the sounds, and maybe just even the visual qualities, yet again, of these objects.
And there's a comment and a question about the clay fire and glaze interior particularly, and are multiple artifacts in the collection all from the same clay?
Yeah, that's a really terrific question. I've been kind of getting more into this idea of clay from a couple of different standpoints, because there's been some research into even medicinal properties of clays especially from Mexico, from the region of Tonalá in Mexico, and whether vessels that are used to serve water or serve liquids could take on those medicinal qualities. These vessels are all what are known as low fire. That is to say, they don't have access to kilns that can get up to an incredibly high temperature and therefore could vitrify a glaze. So there's no true glazes in the pre-Columbian or ancient Americas prior to the Spaniards' arrival. And so glazes don't really exist. There's slips, but I do wonder to what degree certain types of ceramics, certain types of clay are more efficient, better for musical instruments, or less apt for musical instruments? So that is a really wonderful question that I don't think we've gotten to the bottom of. When we've identified clay sources, it's usually that clay is being used for all kinds of materials, that bowls, plates, and also probably these whistles. But that is a really interesting question about whether there might be clays that are better or worse for musical instruments.
And a follow-up quickly to that question was, if the vessel is low fired, it will likely be quite porous, and moisture as well as liquid level will influence the vessel's resonance.
That's a great point. I mean, you know, do you just let it sit in there for a certain amount of time? Is there an ideal porousness, or what I want to say is there an ideal moment when the water has sort of totally impregnated the ceramic and it's maybe takes on more interesting sonorous qualities? Yeah, so that is a terrific question, Andrew, and thank you for that.
Did the different Peruvian cultures use similar technology in making musical vessels?
Sorry, can you just say that one more time?
Did the different Peruvian cultures use similar technology in making musical vessels?
Right, yes, okay, we didn't have time to kind of cover everything, but yes, these types of whistling vessels actually go back and probably originate in Ecuador. Ecuador is very proud, and I should have mentioned that, to be probably the originators of the whistling vessels, and some of them go back, I believe, as far back as 1000 CE, you know, before the Common Era, or maybe even earlier than that. It goes back quite a ways. So there are many different cultures that are making whistling vessels. We know for sure that this is Sican because of the decoration of it, that there's certain stylistic clues that show us that it's Sican. But yes, all of them, or many of the cultures, are making whistling vessels, yes.
Let's see, how much archaeological information is available for these cultures?
Great question. Yeah, so there is quite a bit of archaeological information. Archaeological research continues to go on in Peru, and has been going on in a, you know, quite continuous way, certainly since I would say the 20s and 30s. I mean, prior to that as well, but I think the more scientific archaeological method is probably dating to, say, the 20s and 30s, and you have people like Julio Tello and others who are really doing great archaeological research. So the one thing I would say is that this is the great thing about modern technology, is that we are sometimes able to access Peruvian journals of archaeology through the internet, seek them out, be in touch with scholars, and find out more about these objects through that means.
How do you think the vessel was created to leave the openings? Why did wood vessels have to come from the same trunk? And how do you know this? That was a three-parter.
Okay, so the wood vessel, I'm going to start with the wood vessels. Delisa, just leave that up there for just a second so I can think about this. But the wood vessels, I know this is such an interesting thing that we do know from what we call ethnohistoric sources, which is to say some of the sources that were written down by Spanish friars, Spanish chroniclers and informants. They were really struck by the fact that the wooden vessels, known as carros, needed to be made from the same piece of wood. Why did they have to come from the same trunk? It was like, I mean, I think it goes back to this idea of duality. They're almost conceived of maybe like siblings, right? That it's from the same trunk, and yet one will be slightly different than the other. It's a whole, but that whole is only made up of the two parts. So yeah, and then how do I think the vessel was created to leave the openings? I have to say this was the biggest surprise for me too, because I look at this vessel, so some of the other things that I showed you in an earlier slide, this figurines, you look on the back of it, okay, there's a hole and you know that you blow into that, like perfect. It's a figurine, but it's also a whistle, great. But this one was such a kind of mystery, And it turned out that the channel is through that incredibly thin strap. And that for me just brought home how the purpose of this is made to be a noisemaker, because you do not make this beautifully curved, arched, thin strap and then somehow figure out how to get this really thin little channel through it and then fire it without having a lot of forethought about that. So it was created to leave the openings by making that handle very thin, but with a channel through it.
Where do you envision these vessels would have been played, inside or outside?
It's not a huge sound. I mean, I think it's, I'm somebody who, I love to ponder the questions and maybe don't come down on one side or the other so quickly. But I thought Sonia asking that question was a fabulous question. I think I would probably come down on the side of being played in some interior space. And you could imagine if it's an interior space that's dark, maybe not tiny, you know, but and you're not aware of where you are, that these high-pitched noises could be disorienting, could help you to sort of go into a trance state, or just help to just encourage contemplation. I would think maybe indoors because it's not that loud. But if you do go to the video there, I did reference a video there with Melissa Foss, which is a video of her, her orchestra in Argentina with these indigenous instruments. And in at least one part of that, you see this guy playing a vessel that's about yay big, a whistling vessel, and he's playing it as part of the orchestra. So I could be wrong. It could be that many of these are played at one time in an outdoor area and the sound would carry.
Is anything known about the makers of these vessels? And I guess it means, were they specialists?
Yeah, it does seem as though there definitely are ceramic specialists. When people have excavated, going back to the, how do we know about these vessels, the archaeological excavation, when people have excavated some of these sites and cities, in the case of this culture, there's a city known as Sican, there's a city, ancient city known as Sican, one known as Lambayeque, that we find neighborhoods in many cases or workshops. And the tools of a workshop of a ceramics worker are recognizable. You've got stones to burnish things, you've got the kiln. So we do know that probably these would have been made by specialists. Yeah, they would have been made by ceramic specialists.
And how commonplace were these vessels? Would everybody have had one, or were just important people in a community?
That's a really hard question to answer. That's a really good question. But I know more. These have been studied more extensively by that archaeologist and art historian that I referenced, Juliet Wiersema, in the case of the Moche. And I think there she estimated that of all of the ceramic fragments they're finding on the ground in one of these sites, that it's a very high proportion that are fragments of whistles. And so I do think it's something that a large majority of the population would have access to some type of whistle. I mean, we find whistles and whistling objects at kind of all levels. This one is really quite beautifully made, right? It's not just the form of it and that they have these mold made pelicans, but then it's been painted with slip paints. It's a very nicely made object. Now, some of them are just sort of clay formed into a form and fired. So I think many people would have had access to these, but perhaps this is the kind of thing that it would have been more somebody who's elite who has access to it.
You have one of these pelican vessels. How many do you think were made? No pressure or mass produced?
Yeah, so in the article I write about how there's a double chambered vessel in, I believe it's the Museo Larco in Peru, which has two pelicans on the front of it, which are extremely similar, like to the degree that I wonder if it's the same mold that was used. So what I do want to say is, yeah, I actually do think they may have been mass produced, and certainly they're using molds for some of the pieces on them, and then hand building for other parts of it. So I do think we're talking, and in terms of pelican vessels, there are quite a few that have other pelicans, not quite so similar looking, in these beautiful Totoro reed boats. There's one in the British Museum. There's some in the Metropolitan Museum. As you start looking for these, there's a lot in museums all around the world, and of course, especially in Peru. So I would say they were, I don't know about mass produced, but they were certainly produced in great quantities, yeah.
And then were whistles found in burial sites?
Yeah, they definitely have been found in tombs, and as well as just in just sort of refuse and, you know, house sites that people have excavated. So yeah, they definitely could have been part of a burial rituals and then just left in the tomb.
So we do have a comment. The maker would be located near the source of clay, and I imagine the finished vessel may travel lighter weight, albeit fragile.
Yeah, I mean, when I had looked at this one's known as a bridge and spout vessel in a way, in terms of its style. There's the bridge, the handle, and then the one spout. And originally, the spouts are so narrow, which helps to prevent the evaporation of water. So that's great. And those handles, it might mean also that you could tie, you know, strings to two of these that are equal size and weight and just throw them over the back of a llama and transport them across the Andes. So for sure, they could have traveled, but you're right, the ceramicist would have needed to live pretty close to the sources of clay. That is absolutely right, yeah.
We do have another comment that they are cute and it's probably unintentional.
Well, there's a, I note, I was looking for this earlier today on the Walters website, and I don't know if all of you are aware, but the Walters website allows you to make your own little collections of items that you're interested in coming back to and looking at again. And a user named Ann R, so not the same person, made a collection called Cuteism. And this is one of the objects in Cuteism. So if you're interested in seeing more cute objects, for sure, you can look up Cuteism on the website and find more, or just make your own collection. Maybe it's the super cute collection on the website.
Okay, well, that's all the time that we have for questions. Thank you again so much, Ellen, for sharing this unique work in the Walters collection with us. Thank you. Thank you all again for joining us today for our second virtual member talk. We are so thankful for your commitment to the Walters Art Museum, which is an essential part of our stability and future. And we hope you can join us for the next virtual member talk in September. And yes, please be on the lookout for an invitation in your inbox to register coming soon. And we look forward to seeing you when we can open our doors again. And we hope that you stay healthy and safe and you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.